This is slightly daunting. It's something that perhaps as doctors we're more familiar with presenting on topics like evidence-based medicine and lots of facts and sort of that sort of thing. And that's easier when you have an overhead behind you. But I've been asked to come here as a storyteller, which, as I say, is slightly more daunting. And I hope I'm not going to be ridiculously boring. But I did think about what kind of story or stories I might tell you about my own experience as being a doctor and that kind of thing coming here today. And I thought of humorous anecdotes like the time that a woman came to me in a panic with this kind of grey, fungating sort of a rash around the side of her abdomen, and she was horrified. And she said, "It's been there for a week. Oh my God, what is it?" And I picked at it, and it was chewing gum. But but that's not the kind of story I'm going to tell you, although I'm sure we all have those types of stories we could tell. I tried to think for this presentation today about stories from medicine that stood out for me and meant something to me and stayed with me because I thought they might be the most interesting stories. And because of that, what I suppose is relatively interesting was the ones that stood out for me and stayed with me. A lot of them came from my junior doctor years. I suppose that initial phase when we first become doctors and we first get our white coats and our bleeps and we struggle with imposter syndrome, the things that happened around that time, I suppose because they were a first and they were new, were something that maybe have stayed with me over the course of my career. And I'm 20 years this year graduated as a doctor, so it's a long time. But when I was an intern first, I worked in the Mater Hospital and I was on the professorial team under Professor David Powell, who was a lovely gentleman and a lovely kind of old school professor of medicine. And he was very kind and he was very formal. And that was the era of medicine that I started out. And I think it's a little different now. But he was famous actually in the Mater. This is also not the kind of story I want to tell you, but he was famous in the Mater because he had been married to Miss World, and that was a big deal to us all at the time. And the story went that Miss World had been going out with David Powell, but also at the same time had been going out with David Frost. And she came into her room one day, and there was an array of flowers with a card saying, "Will you marry me, love David?" And she said yes, but she expected to be married to a famous broadcaster and ended up married to an endocrinologist in Dublin. But I was his intern, and I learned a huge amount medically, but I've never been really as interested in what I've learned medically as a doctor. I think far more interesting is what you learn humanly as a doctor. So one of the things that stood out for me at that time was the first time I had ever had to tell somebody that they were going to die. See, I told you I'd bring it right down. And that has stayed with me to this day, so much so that I can remember the woman's name and what she looks like and everything, or looked like. It shouldn't have been a case in the Mater back in 1997 that an intern would have been involved in telling somebody that she was going to die, but through a series of unfortunate events with the consultant being away, there was only myself and one other junior doctor on. This woman had come in on call. She had been vomiting blood. We had presumed this 33-year-old lady was going to have an ulcer or something like that. But when they scoped her, they discovered that she actually had very advanced gastric cancer and that there wasn't going to be anything that could be done. And she had to immediately enter a program of treatment, so she had to be told. And myself and this other junior doctor, I remember very clearly standing outside the room. They'd given her a private room, even though she would have been a public patient. I remember very clearly standing outside and trying to steel ourselves for what we were about to do and going into the room. And we had asked, was she by herself? Because we didn't want to break such news to her by herself. But as it happened, who she was with was her husband and two tiny children. Her husband didn't speak almost any English. He was a man from, I think, Saudi Arabia or somewhere. But we were there looking at this 33-year-old woman and had to explain to her that she had gastric cancer. And she asked us, was it going to be curable? And we said no. And I remember watching these children playing around her feet, and her husband was kind of wondering what was going on. And just that feeling of sickness inside as a person, let alone as a doctor, while that was happening. But what stayed with me was her reaction. She didn't really miss a beat. She paused. She'd just been told she was dying, and then she took my arm and she said, "I need you to help me." And I was like, "Okay," and she said, "You need to get a house. You need to get a house for me and my children," because she was obviously she was inner city Dublin. She was quite impoverished. Obviously, they were obviously probably in rented accommodation, and she immediately switched from, what's going to happen to me, to that being insignificant, what's going to happen to my kids. And it was the first time I ever really realized what it was to be a doctor, that it wasn't about a white coat and it wasn't about a bleep and it wasn't about knowing a list of sort of things in the Oxford Clinical Handbook. It was much different and it was much bigger than that. And that very much stayed with me for a long time afterwards. The next thing that stood out for me in that period of time, as something with impact, these were all very bleak, they're not supposed to be, but it was the first time I'd met somebody who'd ever tried to kill themselves. And that, I felt from that first story that I kind of was learning a little bit what it was to be a doctor and the responsibility of that. But the next sort of experience I had that stayed with me was also on that same ward rotation, on that same job, being down in A&E one morning, and we were going round all the people we had taken on call the night before, and we came to this woman, and she was a very kind of frail and vulnerable looking woman with her wrists bandaged. And she was sitting in this cubicle kind of shaking and eating tea and toast at 6:30 in the morning, or whatever ungodly hour we used to call around to see people at. And we traipsed in, and we didn't really necessarily know what all these people had happened to them the night before. And there was just a small curtain around the cubicle, as you are all familiar with from A&E. There's no privacy or anything. And I do remember the professor of medicine saying, "What happened then? What happened here?" And she actually said, I tried to kill myself," in this very tiny little voice. And he said, "Really? Well, I hope you know that you've caused an awful lot of people an awful lot of trouble." And there was about 12 of us in the room, because that was the way those professorial teams were. There would be the professor, and then there'd be sort of senior registrars, and then registrars and SHOs and interns. And we were all there, all looking at this woman, and she kind of looked up at us all. And I remember thinking, oh my God. And what that taught me was the kind of doctor, to be honest, that I didn't want to be, because I felt we completely failed her as a system and as people and as doctors that morning. And so that always stayed with me. And then another thing that stayed with me quite peculiarly, I suppose, was hearing about another doctor who had been an intern in the same sort of role as me, who was now in the High Court. This was very shocking when you're a junior doctor, that doctors might end up being sued. And they were in the High Court because they had given an injection to a woman of a cephalosporin IV antibiotic, which they'd been told to give to the woman, and there was no reason not to. The woman wasn't allergic to cephalosporins or anything like that, and the registrar had told this intern to give the drug, and that was fine. But it turns out the woman had been allergic to penicillins, and of course there is, for some people, about 10% maybe, a crossover of allergy there, which wasn't known and couldn't have been known really. But she did go into anaphylaxis and she did die, and there was an inquiry, and it did end up in court. And I remember being very shocked at the unfairness that this intern was going to have to go to court because somebody had died, when they were only doing what they were told. They were only following orders, really. And we, had very little say as junior doctors into what we did or didn't do. And then an older doctor saying to me, "But what do you expect? You're a doctor, you're in the professions, you have to stand over everything you do. Do you not realize that?" And that was the first time that it ever struck me that we were all independent practitioners, that it was all very well to be collegial or to have peers or to be, supportive of one another, but our ultimate responsibility was to our patients. And we would always be the one to sort of have to face that responsibility should it arise. And I thought that was a very kind of challenging, and it took me a while to actually understand that, I think, as well. And the last thing that stood with me from that time, really, I think I'm going to run out of things to say very quickly here, actually, was another patient on that same professorial ward round. I think they all stayed with me because I was so early in my career. But he was a very nice sort of man in his 60s. He reminded me very much of my father. It was quite interesting. I think I projected that onto him. He just reminded me of my dad. He was very respectful and quite formal, and he was waiting in hospital, as many people do, for an investigation. He was waiting for a scope. And like many people on the ward, he was fasted that morning and waited, for his sort of trolley to arrive to bring him down to the endoscopy unit. And of course, like many people, he was bumped off the list because other things happened and these places are very busy. And we would come round the next day and look and see what the result of a scope was. And then we would see that he hadn't had the scope and we'd say, well, today then so. And this happened for 3 days in a row. And on the third day, we came around, this giant unwieldy team, and stood around the bed in that intimidating fashion that we, I suppose, have. And he was quite annoyed. And he said, I've been fasted here on this ward for 3 days. I've had tea and toast to eat. That's all I've had to eat in the evenings for 3 days. Will somebody tell me what's going to happen? And it was quite clear to me. I could see that he was frightened and he felt disempowered. And he, was angry, but he was more upset, and a lot of it was fear-driven. There was a big kind of a fear around that. And, he was told there was nothing we could do, that he'd been bumped from the endoscopy list, that this is how things are and this is how things were, and he would have to wait. And he said, well, will you tell me, will I have it tomorrow? And it was admitted we could not tell him for certain that he was, although we hoped that was the case. And he was quite annoyed, and he'd been very respectful. I think he was of that era and of that type that, respected doctors and respected us and all of that, but he was upset. And so he kind of grumbled a little bit, and we left the bed. And the same professor turned around to one of the regs and said, I think we need a psych consult there. And it was at that point that I decided I wanted to be a GP. And those little things fed into why I didn't want to stay in hospital medicine. And I know hospital medicine, many of you here work in hospital medicine. But I think it was, for me, in that era, I think certainly it was a very brutalizing regime, both for the people who worked within it, but also for some of the people that were patients of it too. I think it does squeeze somehow the compassion out of us a little bit. But I decided I wanted to be a GP, I suppose, for 2 reasons. One was that I didn't want the hierarchy, actually. I didn't want to have bosses, and I didn't necessarily want to have underlings either. I quite liked the egalitarian sort of system of general practice. I liked the idea of qualifying quite quickly and not having to go through endless years of training as well, to be honest. But I also liked the idea of patients, not quite as peers, but very much at a lesser remove from us as doctors, and for me it was the right move. That situation in hospital medicine never quite sat with me, and I still remember that man today, the man who did get a psych consult, which was just ridiculous, but doctors didn't know how to say no to other doctors either at the time. And he did remind me of my father, and I was reminded of it again. My father died in hospital some years ago, and when he'd had a heart attack and he went in and he was being admitted and they were going to do a bypass and all that kind of stuff, and that was all happening. But when he was being transferred from the A&E to the ward, and he was in those gowns that do nothing for anybody, but he asked if he could have his shoes and socks put back on. He wanted to put his shoes and socks back on. And there was a junior doctor there who looked at him like, what a weirdo. And I understood why he wanted his shoes and socks back on. He wasn't going to be even walking. It was about dignity. And I think that dignity for our patients is and also for ourselves is very important. And I think we should never forget just how close we are to them and how close they are to us, and the fact that at some point we will be them, because all of us at some point will be a patient as well as a doctor. And that's really all. That's all I came up with to tell you in terms of stories today. I'm sorry if I've spoken too quickly. Stephen is drawing me, and he told me I was to speak slowly so that he had had time, because apparently he's not very quick, but I don't think that's true. But that's all I wanted to say, that those are the things, and the kind of remit I was given was to tell a story about something that maybe coloured how you viewed medicine or coloured what you thought about it or how you practiced. And oddly, the stories that have stayed with me are from quite a long time ago. And they've still stayed with me, and I still remember those patients' names, which is a bit peculiar. But anyway, I don't know if I've talked for too long or not long enough, but thank you very much.